What happens when a couple's dream wedding turns into an all-out battle with their HOA? Maya and Jamal had always dreamed of a simple, beautiful backyard wedding, a celebration of their love, surrounded by family and friends. But when the HOA steps in and bans their wedding due to vague noise complaints and property use regulations, everything changes. As the HOA refuses to budge, Maya and Jamal are forced to fight back, using legal action, media attention, and support from their neighbors. The wedding soon becomes the focal point of a larger fight for personal rights against an overreaching HOA. But when the HOA starts spreading false rumors and trying to sabotage their event, what happens when this quiet neighborhood turns into a battlefield? Their wedding becomes a battleground for love, defiance, and community solidarity. Will they win the fight of their lives, or will the HOA steal their dream forever? Maya and Jamal had been planning their wedding for months. As a couple, they had always been simple, quiet people. They didn't need an extravagant affair, just a beautiful celebration of their love, with close friends and family gathered in their backyard. Jamal, a hard-working graphic designer, and Maya, a community outreach coordinator, had always dreamed of this moment. It wasn't about grandeur, it was about being together, surrounded by people who had supported them through thick and thin. The backyard itself wasn't anything spectacular. A few flower beds lined the edges, and an old oak tree stood proudly in the corner, with a hammock draped between its sturdy limbs. It was a modest space, but to them, it was perfect. They had visions of white lights strung across the trees, candles on the tables, and the soft hum of music playing in the background. The weather would be warm and everything would fall into place. When they first submitted the permit for their wedding to the HOA, they didn't expect much. They figured that being a quiet, respectful couple, they would receive approval without any issues. The HOA had always been strict about property rules. No excessive noise, no eyesores, and no major gatherings unless explicitly approved, but they had assumed their small wedding would fall within acceptable limits. However, just a week later, Maya received a letter from the HOA. She tore open the envelope, thinking it would be a simple approval or a request for further details. Instead, she was met with a cold, impersonal rejection. The letter stated that their wedding would violate several clauses in the HOA's bylaws. It cited noise complaints, the use of property for a non-standard event, and the potential disruption to neighbors. Maya was taken aback. She immediately called Jamal, who was equally stunned. Their initial response was disbelief. They hadn't done anything wrong. They had been respectful of the HOA's rules. They had never hosted large parties or made excessive noise. The idea that their wedding, a small gathering with only close friends and family, would be deemed a violation of the HOA's guidelines seemed ludicrous. The letter didn't explain much beyond the vague references to noise concerns. There was no mention of specific complaints or evidence of anything that would justify such drastic action. But the HOA was firm. They gave them an ultimatum: cancel the wedding or face fines. Maya and Jamal were crushed. The wedding they had worked so hard to plan, a dream that was within their grasp, was being taken away by an institution they had never imagined would interfere in such a personal moment. But they weren't the type to back down. They had to fight for what they wanted, their love and their celebration. Maya began gathering her thoughts, but a nagging suspicion began to creep into her mind. Why were they being singled out? They weren't the first couple to host a private event in their backyard. In fact, there had been neighborhood parties, barbecues, and other gatherings in the past that had been much larger and louder. Why was this wedding different? Something wasn't adding up. Jamal shared her concerns. He believed the HOA had an agenda, and it wasn't just about noise, it was about control. The more they thought about it, the more they realized that this wasn't just about a wedding. It was about their right to live freely in their own home without the overreach of the HOA. They weren't going to let this go. The letter from the HOA had shattered Maya and Jamal's dreams of a simple wedding in their own backyard. Yet beneath the surface of their disappointment, something else began to stir: determination. If the HOA thought they could control their lives in this way, they were gravely mistaken. They weren't going to let some anonymous bureaucrats decide when and where they could celebrate their love. Maya, a calm and steady presence in their relationship, began researching their options. She scoured legal advice forums and contacted a lawyer who specialized in property law. She and Jamal knew they had to act quickly if they wanted to salvage their wedding plans. Their first meeting with the lawyer didn't provide much reassurance, but it did offer hope. The lawyer, a middle-aged black man named Mr. Thornton, was sympathetic to their cause. He explained that in the eyes of the law, the HOA's decision was not only arbitrary, but potentially illegal. He also noted that HOAs often overstep their bounds, and this kind of situation was more common than people realized. They had rights, and the HOA's bylaws, while powerful within the confines of the neighborhood, did not have the ultimate say in matters of personal liberty. Mr. Thornton didn't make promises, but he was clear in his belief that the HOA was likely abusing its power. He suggested they fight back, but not with force or loud protests. Instead, they would take a legal route. The first step would be to formally challenge the HOA's decision. It wasn't an easy path, but it was a path they could take. Jamal, ever the optimist, was ready to go all in. He wasn't going to let the HOA ruin his wedding, not without a fight. Maya, however, felt the weight of what was at stake. Their lives had always been about peace. She didn't want to escalate the situation further than it already had gone. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized the stakes. It wasn't just about a wedding anymore. It was about their rights, their autonomy, and their ability to make decisions for their own lives. If they backed down now, they would be setting a dangerous precedent for the future. As the days passed, Maya and Jamal made their case stronger. Mr. Thornton guided them through the process, advising them on how to approach the HOA legally. The couple sent a formal letter explaining that they had no intention of canceling the wedding and that the HOA had no legal right to interfere with their plans. They emphasized their willingness to resolve the situation peacefully, but made it clear they were prepared for a legal showdown if necessary. However, the HOA's response wasn't what they expected. Instead of addressing the legal issues, the HOA sent a letter filled with more threats. This time they escalated things by accusing Maya and Jamal of being uncooperative and difficult. They also insinuated that the wedding would cause irreparable harm to the community, spreading rumors that the couple had a history of creating problems with the neighborhood's rules. The HOA's letter suggested that Maya and Jamal were just troublemakers, unwilling to follow the rules like everyone else. The couple was furious. These were blatant lies designed to discredit them and turn the neighborhood against them. They weren't just being targeted for their wedding, they were being villainized by the HOA. They decided it was time to show the community what was really going on. They posted a message on social media telling the story of their fight with the HOA. Maya's account, which had always been a space for positivity and uplifting content, now became a platform for their crusade against the HOA. She shared details of the threats they'd received, the lies being spread, and their determination to stand up for their rights. Jamal, who had always kept a low profile, began reaching out to influencers and journalists who had followed similar property rights battles. Soon the story gained traction, and the couple started receiving messages of support from neighbors and strangers alike. The next day, as they were getting ready to meet with their lawyer again, something unexpected happened. A group of neighbors, some of whom they had never even met before, arrived at their front door with a petition. They had seen the couple's social media posts and wanted to show their support. The petition, with signatures from over 20 people, demanded that the HOA allow the wedding to proceed. The neighbors had rallied around them, and they didn't want to back down either. Maya was moved by their support, but also stunned. What had started as a personal fight now had the potential to change everything. The neighborhood was taking a stand not just for their wedding, but for the right to live freely without oppressive oversight. But she also knew this could be the beginning of something much larger, a movement that could challenge the HOA's authority in the entire neighborhood. They scheduled a meeting with the HOA to present their case, bringing the petition and legal backing with them. The stakes were higher now. It wasn't just about their wedding. It was about pushing back against an entity that had too much power over the lives of the homeowners. It wasn't just their right to have a wedding, it was everyone's right to live with dignity and autonomy, free from unnecessary interference. As they prepared for this next phase, Jamal and Maya knew they were in for a fight, but they also knew they were not alone anymore. They had the support of their neighbors, and they had a lawyer who believed in their cause. The wedding, which was supposed to be a celebration of their love, had now become the battleground for something far greater: the future of their neighborhood's freedoms. The tension in the air was palpable as Maya and Jamal stood outside the HOA office, petition in hand. They had been preparing for this day for weeks, gathering signatures, consulting their lawyer, and rallying the support of their neighbors. Now they were about to face the HOA board, the very same people who had tried to tear their wedding apart, accusing them of undermining the integrity of the community. This wasn't just a fight for a wedding anymore. This was a fight for their home, their dignity, and their right to live their lives without oppressive oversight. As they walked into the office, their hearts pounded in their chests. The atmosphere was stiff, sterile, and oppressive, the complete opposite of the warmth they had envisioned for their wedding day. The HOA members, sitting behind a large wooden table, watched them with cold, indifferent eyes. It felt like they were facing an intimidating panel of bureaucrats, as if their personal lives had become just another item on a long list of administrative tasks. Maya and Jamal stood tall, ready to face whatever was coming next. Behind them, they could feel the support of their neighbors, their voices echoing in the back of their minds. As they walked in, Jamal gave a quick, reassuring squeeze of Maya's hand. He had never been one to get worked up about confrontations, but this was different. This wasn't just about one decision, this was about their right to live freely. The board members looked at them with a mix of skepticism and dismissal. The HOA president, a man named Richard Grant, stood up first. He was tall, with gray hair and a sharp, angular face that radiated authority. He adjusted his glasses and began, his voice dripping with condescension. "Maya and Jamal, we've reviewed your case. But I must tell you, the decision stands. Your wedding is a violation of our community standards. You've caused unnecessary disruption, and your request to move forward is simply unreasonable." The words stung, and for a moment, Maya felt a surge of anger rise in her chest. She had known the HOA would not back down easily, but hearing these words from Richard, the very man who had rejected their request without hesitation, made her blood boil. She opened her mouth, ready to fight back, but Jamal placed a firm hand on her arm, signaling for her to remain calm. "Mr. Grant," Jamal began, his voice even but firm, "this is not just about a wedding. It's about how this community is being treated. This is about your overreach. You can't dictate our lives like this. You're punishing us for something that every other neighbor has done in some form or another. And it's not right." Maya nodded in agreement, standing beside him. "We've done nothing to harm this neighborhood. Our wedding is not a massive event, it's a private gathering. There are no reasons to prevent it. We're asking for fairness, not special treatment." The room was silent for a moment. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke. Richard Grant, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, fidgeted with his pen before speaking again. "You're disregarding the rules of this community, and that's the issue. Your wedding is just the tip of the iceberg. Allowing you to break these rules sets a dangerous precedent. What's next? Parties? Noise complaints? You're stirring the pot." Maya could feel her frustration building, but she managed to keep her composure. "You're not listening. This isn't about breaking the rules. It's about living in a community that respects each other's rights. You claim this is about noise, but no one has even provided proof of that. You've targeted us unfairly." At this point, Jamal stepped forward, holding the petition high in the air. "We have over 30 signatures from your neighbors who are standing with us. They don't agree with the way you're handling this. They believe in our right to hold a peaceful wedding. We're not the problem here, you are." Richard Grant's face reddened, and he hesitated before speaking again. "The HOA board will review your case and respond in due course, but I assure you the decision will not change. We are not swayed by public opinion." Jamal's eyes narrowed, but Maya gently tugged at his sleeve. The last thing they needed was for this to escalate into a shouting match. The tension in the room was thick, and the HOA was clearly digging in its heels. Maya could feel the weight of the situation. This wasn't just a matter of fighting for their wedding. This was about standing up to a system that allowed their personal freedoms to be trampled upon. As they left the HOA office, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. She had expected the board to resist, but their arrogance and unwillingness to listen had taken her by surprise. The fact that the HOA was willing to escalate things, to fight so hard against something as simple as a wedding, made her wonder how much power the HOA really had in this neighborhood. Maya sat at the kitchen table staring at her phone. The screen was filled with notifications, comments, messages, shares. Their fight with the HOA had gone viral. The story had been picked up by local news outlets, then shared by influencers. And before long, even national platforms were starting to notice. What started as a small battle over a wedding had become a full-fledged movement, and Maya was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. People from all over the country, even those in different cities, were rallying behind them. Messages poured in. People who had been through similar experiences. People who had also fought for their rights against overbearing HOAs. Jamal walked into the room, a cup of coffee in his hand, his eyes scanning the flurry of social media activity. He couldn't hide the smile on his face. The couple had been expecting resistance, but the overwhelming wave of support had caught them off guard. "This is bigger than we thought," Jamal said, his voice a mix of disbelief and excitement. "People are coming out of the woodwork, Maya." Maya nodded, but her mind was still racing. "It's not just about the wedding anymore. It's about standing up to this whole system." Their lawyer, Mr. Thornton, had been their guiding light in all of this, offering advice and steadying their resolve as they navigated the legal labyrinth. But now, with the growing media attention, they knew they had to shift strategies. What had begun as a personal fight against the HOA was now a battle for the freedom of every homeowner in the neighborhood. The couple's defiance had sparked something much larger. It was a Saturday morning when the HOA sent their next letter. This time there was no legal jargon, no threats about noise complaints. Instead, the HOA had launched an outright smear campaign. The letter, mailed to every resident in the neighborhood, contained unfounded accusations against Maya and Jamal. It claimed that they were using their wedding to further their own political agenda, and they even went so far as to suggest that Maya and Jamal were dangerous radicals who might encourage further chaos in the neighborhood. The words stung. How could they distort something so personal into something so malicious? The HOA had stooped to a new low, trying to manipulate the community against them. But this time, Maya and Jamal weren't going to back down. Instead of feeling defeated, they felt their resolve harden. They had a community behind them now, and they were more determined than ever to see this through. As the days passed, the community's support only grew stronger. A group of neighbors led by Ms. Jenkins, the elderly woman who had lived on their street for decades, came over with more signatures, more evidence of the neighborhood's support. Ms. Jenkins was feisty and determined, with a sharp wit that belied her years. She was the first person to knock on Maya and Jamal's door, insisting that they weren't going to let the HOA win. "They may be the ones with the power," Ms. Jenkins said, her voice low but fierce. "But we have the people, and the people won't stand for it." The couple now had a movement on their hands. Neighbors who had once stayed quiet were now speaking out, showing their support with petitions and public statements. The HOA, once so sure of its control, was beginning to lose grip. It was clear to everyone involved that this was about more than just one couple's wedding. This was about standing up to an institution that had been overstepping its boundaries for too long. A few days later, the couple hosted a community rally in their front yard. It wasn't a protest in the traditional sense, but a gathering of neighbors and supporters. They called it a celebration of unity, a chance for everyone to come together to show that they weren't going to allow the HOA to control them anymore. The lawn was decorated with strings of lights, and a table was set up with signs, banners, and a speaker system where neighbors could voice their support. Maya and Jamal stood at the front of their yard, surrounded by their neighbors and friends. They couldn't help but be amazed by the energy that filled the air. People were speaking openly about their frustrations with the HOA. Neighbors shared stories about how the HOA had fined them for minor infractions, like an overgrown garden or a misplaced trash can. These weren't just complaints about a wedding. This was a community's deep-seated frustration with the HOA's overreach. By the end of the day, the rally had turned into something more than just a demonstration. It had become a statement, a show of solidarity and defiance that echoed through the entire neighborhood. The most powerful message, however, was the one they had all sent together. They weren't going to be intimidated by the HOA anymore. But as the day came to a close, Maya's phone buzzed with a new message. It was from a reporter at one of the local news stations. The media was now fully invested in their story. They wanted an interview. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Maya allowed herself to feel a spark of hope. The message was clear. This wasn't just their fight anymore. The whole neighborhood had become a symbol of resistance. And this time, they were going to win. The days leading up to the wedding were a blur of activity. Maya and Jamal had spent every waking moment preparing, not just for their big day, but for the final showdown with the HOA. The community rally had shifted the momentum, but the HOA wasn't going to give up easily. The couple knew that the HOA would pull out all the stops to stop them, but they were determined not to back down. This wasn't just about their wedding anymore. It was about taking a stand for every homeowner who had ever been bullied by an overreaching HOA. With the wedding just days away, the tension in the neighborhood was at an all-time high. Neighbors who had been on the fence about taking a stand were now showing up at Maya and Jamal's door, offering help, support, and even donations for the wedding. Local businesses, especially those owned by black entrepreneurs, began offering services for free or at a steep discount, eager to show their support for the couple's cause. The local news stations were buzzing with coverage of the story. The cameras followed Maya and Jamal as they set up decorations in their yard. It wasn't just a wedding anymore. It had become a spectacle, a symbol of resistance against the power of HOAs and the establishment that sought to control their lives. Maya felt a sense of pride as she watched her neighbors work together to transform their backyard into a beautiful wedding venue. But she knew that the fight wasn't over. The HOA had already promised legal action if the wedding went forward, and they had warned the couple that they would stop at nothing to prevent the event. As much as the support from their community reassured her, Maya couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. The HOA's attempts to destroy their dream had turned this into something far more serious, and the stress was beginning to take its toll. As the sun began to set on the eve of their wedding, the couple received a letter from the HOA that was even more threatening than before. The letter informed them that they were being fined yet again, this time for damaging the community's aesthetic with their wedding preparations. It included veiled threats of legal action that could result in fines or even a forced sale of their property. The HOA, it seemed, was trying to break them, but Maya and Jamal weren't backing down. They had come too far to let the HOA win. The couple knew they had the legal right to hold their wedding on their property, but it wasn't just about the law. This was about showing the HOA and the rest of the community that they would no longer be pushed around. On the morning of the wedding, as Jamal dressed in his suit, his mind was racing. His thoughts were filled with the faces of his neighbors, all of them coming together in solidarity. They weren't just attending a wedding, they were joining a movement. For Jamal, that was what made this day so special. It wasn't just about celebrating his love for Maya. It was about reclaiming their freedom, their home, and their dignity. Maya was putting the final touches on her dress when the doorbell rang. A police officer stood on the doorstep, holding another letter from the HOA. He explained that the HOA had filed a complaint, saying that they feared a public disturbance from the wedding, and that they had requested the police to come and investigate the situation. Maya was taken aback, but she remained calm. The police officer, seeing the chaos that the HOA had stirred, simply asked if everything was okay and wished them well. It was clear that the officer knew the HOA was overstepping, but there was little he could do. As Maya closed the door, she shared a look with Jamal. They both knew this wasn't just about their wedding anymore. It had become something bigger. It was about the rights of every homeowner who had ever felt the heavy hand of an HOA press down on them. Despite the threats, the fines, and the interference from the HOA, the wedding proceeded as planned. The lawn was alive with the sounds of guests chatting, laughing, and celebrating. Jamal stood at the front, waiting for Maya to walk down the aisle. The moment she appeared, her face radiant in the sunlight, the entire neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. The ceremony was simple, but it felt like a victory. The couple had fought for their right to celebrate their love in their own space, and now they were finally able to do so. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a symbol of defiance against those who sought to control their lives. But the most incredible moment came when, midway through the ceremony, the neighborhood erupted in applause. People who had been quietly supportive in the background were now openly showing their solidarity. It was clear that this wasn't just about one couple's wedding anymore. It was a community standing up to the power of the HOA. As the ceremony came to a close, the party began in full swing. Maya and Jamal had planned a small reception, but with the entire neighborhood joining in, it turned into something much bigger. Music filled the air, children played in the yard, and the once quiet street was alive with celebration. Neighbors, who had never spoken to each other, were laughing and dancing together, united by a cause far bigger than any of them had imagined. But even as they celebrated, the HOA wasn't finished. The couple knew the fight wasn't over. As the night went on, the lights in the houses across the street flickered ominously. The HOA was watching, waiting, and plotting their next move. But for that moment, as Maya and Jamal danced together, under the stars, they couldn't help but feel a sense of victory. They had fought for their dream, and with the support of their community, they had won. The day after the wedding, Maya and Jamal woke up to a flood of messages, both congratulatory and furious. News outlets had covered the event, and social media had erupted in praise of the couple's defiance. Hashtags like #HoFight and Free the Backyard Wedding trended across platforms, gaining national attention. It was a victory, no doubt, but with it came the reality of their situation. The HOA was not going to let this go. Even though their wedding had been a beautiful unifying moment for the community, the HOA was now publicly threatening to take legal action, promising to drag the couple through court if necessary. But despite the mounting pressure, Maya and Jamal had made a decision. They weren't going to back down. Jamal sat at the kitchen table looking at the latest legal documents that had arrived. More fines, more threats, more intimidation tactics. The HOA had become ruthless, with every step they took now aimed at ruining the couple's peace. "They'll do anything to break us," Jamal muttered, his hands gripping the papers tightly. But Maya wasn't listening to the noise anymore. She was tired of running. The public outcry had put the HOA under a magnifying glass, and they were feeling the heat. "I've got an idea," Maya said, her voice steady. She was calm, collected, a woman on a mission. "We need to take this fight to the next level. We need to show the world that we're not just fighting for us, but for every person they've wronged." Jamal looked up at her, his face a mix of curiosity and concern. "What do you mean?" "We need to organize a protest," Maya replied. "But not just any protest. Let's get the whole neighborhood involved. Let's get everyone who's been affected by the HOA, everyone who's ever had to bend to their rules, and let's make this our final stand." Jamal's face softened as he realized the weight of what Maya was suggesting. It was bold. It was risky. But it could be their final push to expose the HOA's true intentions. The couple knew they had to act fast before the HOA could move forward with its plans to drag them into court. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Maya and Jamal reached out to their neighbors and allies, organizing a march that would walk straight up to the HOA's office. They were determined to show that the community was united, not just by the wedding, but by a shared frustration with the overreach of the HOA. Flyers were passed around, social media buzzed with excitement, and the neighborhood came alive with energy. On the day of the protest, the scene was electric. The streets around Maya and Jamal's home were packed with people, families, friends, neighbors, and even strangers who had come from other parts of the city to support the cause. It was no longer just about a couple's wedding. It was about A community's right to live freely, without constant interference from an overbearing institution. Maya and Jamal stood at the front of the crowd side by side. Behind them, banners read, HOA no more, and our homes, our rules. And the energy was palpable. The entire neighborhood seemed to be there, including Ms. Jenkins, who had become a fierce ally and advocate. She marched proudly with her walker, her head held high, the words "Fight for the Future" written on her sign. The march made its way to the HOA building, and as they arrived, the sight of the HOA's quiet, imposing offices seemed almost comical compared to the roar of the crowd that had gathered in front of it. For the first time, the people had power, real, undeniable power, and they were not afraid to use it. Maya took a deep breath as she stood at the front of the crowd, microphone in hand. She knew this was the moment that could change everything. The tension in the air was thick, but there was no turning back now. As she began to speak, the weight of everything they had been through, every sleepless night, every argument, every legal battle, came crashing down on her. But there was no fear. There was only defiance. "This is our home, and we're not going to let anyone take that away from us," Maya shouted, her voice unwavering. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers and chants filling the air. They were with her, every step of the way. Jamal stood beside her, smiling proudly as the community he had grown up in showed their strength. They had done it. The HOA was no longer the oppressive force it had once been. This was their victory. The following days brought more media coverage, and the HOA was forced to respond. The pressure was mounting. Legal threats had failed to stop the couple, and now the public scrutiny was too much to ignore. The HOA found itself in a tight corner, their credibility slipping as more and more residents spoke out about the ways they had been mistreated. In a rare and unexpected move, the HOA finally capitulated. They issued a public apology to Maya and Jamal, dropping all fines and legal actions. It was a hollow victory for the HOA, and they made sure to blame their actions on a miscommunication. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The entire neighborhood had seen through their tactics, and now the HOA's power was significantly weakened. Maya and Jamal stood together, arms around each other, watching as the last of the protesters made their way home. They had won, not just for themselves, but for every homeowner who had ever felt trapped by an overreaching HOA. The wedding that had started it all became a symbol of love, defiance, and community solidarity, and Maya and Jamal knew that their victory had made a difference, not just in their lives, but in the lives of everyone around them. As they stood in front of their home, watching the sun set on the neighborhood, Maya turned to Jamal. "We did it," she said softly. Jamal nodded, pulling her close. "We did it. Together." The community had won. The HOA had lost. And their home was finally theirs, free from the grip of an unjust institution. This was today's secret. Every shed hides a secret. But remember, the shed never stays quiet for long. Until next time, Secret Shed Stories.